It's been a while since my last documentary in this series. I've been attending to a few issues and it's completed now. But before I get to that, I'd like to mention in passing that my latest book, They Got Away with Murder, Volume 4, is now published on Amazon. And I hope those interested will find it a worthwhile addition to the collection. The case of the Mignonette is a very well-known case indeed. The trial of Dudley and Stephens for the murder of cabin boy Richard Parker in 1884 was a landmark case in establishing that necessity was not a defence for murder. Here is my retelling of the tale and my best understanding of the issues involved. In April 1884, an Australian lawyer named John Henry Want visited Britain and bought the Mignonette, a 52-foot yacht, for £400. That's about £60,000 in 2024. He wished to use the yacht for leisure sailing in Australia's coastal waters, and so needed to transport the Mignonette the 15,000 miles necessary to Australia. For this purpose he employed Tom Dudley, a 31-year-old experienced mariner of apparently good character, to sail it from Southampton to Sydney for him. Dudley accordingly recruited two other experienced sailors, Edwin Stephens, 37, and Edmund Brooks, 38, to serve as crew, and 17-year-old Richard Parker was taken on as cabin boy. It was to be Richard Parker's first seagoing voyage, and it was also to be his last. They set sail on the 19th of May 1884 out of Southampton and headed west along the coast of France and northern Spain and down the coast of West Africa, calling at Madeira for coal, provisions and water on the 1st of June. Southeast trade winds carried them out into the Atlantic south of Sierra Leone, and they appeared to have drifted wide of the regular shipping lanes. They had just crossed the Tropic of Capricorn when, on the 5th of July, a gale-force wind blew in 1,600 miles northwest of the Cape of Good Hope. It was 4:30 in the afternoon. The small craft was stable, and the skipper, Tom Dudley, ordered it to heave to, that is, to proceed under fixed helm and sail, so that the crew of 4 could retire for the evening. But no sooner had this order been given than Edwin Stephens, who was at the tiller, cried out, "Look out!" The men clung to the Mignonette boom and deck hatching as a giant wall of sea crashed into the lee side of the ship's hull, that is, the side opposite that of the prevailing wind, crushing the Mignonette between two gigantic forces and smashing the side of the boat. "My God, her side is all knocked in!" cried Stephens. It was quickly apparent that the Mignonette would sink, and skipper Tom Dudley ordered the 13-foot, 4-metre mahogany punt to be lowered. Edmund Brooks took a hatchet to cut the ropes to the punt, while skipper Dudley got hold of the binnacle containing a compass, chronometer, and sextant. Richard Parker, the cabin boy, grabbed a water holder, but it was lost in the turbulent sea. Dudley returned below as the cabins rapidly filled with water to fetch tins of food, but most of these were lost. Just 2 tins of turnips survived before the 4 men scrambled to the lifeboat. Within minutes of their doing so, the Mignonette disappeared, sinking into the heaving ocean. The 4 men were now adrift in the South Atlantic in a tiny rowing boat, little more than a tender, 700 miles from the nearest land, St. Helena, where Napoleon spent his final years in exile. And their ordeal was just beginning. The rowing boat was taking on water, and with some effort they succeeded in finding the source of the leak and plugging it and bailing out much of the seawater. Night came fast, and around midnight a shark came alongside the boat, slapping against it for company, sensing the fear and vulnerability of the men. They fought it off with the boat's oars. By dawn the storm still raged, tossing the boat about carelessly, the seas about them like grey mountains. They constructed a makeshift sea anchor from the binnacle and some planks to stabilize the boat, and Stephens, the mate, got their position from the sun at noon as latitude 2710 south, longitude 950 west. It was a bad place to be, out of the shipping lanes and an impossible distance from land. They were exhausted, frightened, and they were hungry and thirsty too. Tom Dudley was born Thomas Riley Dudley on the 24th of April 1853 at Tolsbury, Essex. He went to sea as a boy and rose quickly to master mariner or skipper in the merchant navy. He married at the age of 28 in 1877, and the couple had 3 children and lived in Surrey. He had command of a variety of vessels in these years, including the steam yacht Myrtle and the Nixia, before he undertook the commission which was to bring him lasting, dubious, and unwanted celebrity. John Want, the lawyer who had bought the Mignonette, hired him via a London yachting agency in the spring of '84. The wages offered were good. Edmund Brooks was paid £5 and 10 shillings per month, 30 shillings more than the usual rate. The seaworthiness of the boat has been questioned, but it was only built in 1867 and was hardly an ancient vessel. More questionable was the position in which the boat was when it foundered, wide of the regular shipping lanes to the Cape, and its suitability for such a voyage. Stephens, the mate, and Brooks, the able-bodied seaman, both had extensive deep-sea going experience. The cabin boy Richard Parker's experience was limited to the south coastal waters of Britain. Both the latter's parents had died some years before, leaving him an orphan, and he had been fostered by Captain Matthews and his wife of Itchen Ferry, Southampton. The 4 men had been at sea for 5 days in their small punt, with only the compass and the stars to fix their position and guide them. Their situation was hopeless. It would be a matter of sheer luck or the favour of the gods if a sail appeared on the horizon. But they didn't give up. Necessity being the mother of invention, when the storm was blown out, they constructed a mast from one of the oars and made a sail from their shirts. To their delight, the boat ran with the sea and the wind, and they took up a course heading west, hoping to catch any ships in the trade route westwards. This was a strange decision of Skipper Dudley's. Their route took advantage of the prevailing trade winds, but it had the hazard, too, of taking them further west into the vastness of the Atlantic. They were possibly as close as 500 or 600 miles off the Namibian coast at this point. Nevertheless, this was their plan. But want of food and water was their most immediate concern. At the end of the 3rd day, they had eaten one of the tins of turnips, and on the 5th they wrested a sea turtle from the water, and killed and butchered it, and ate it with the 2nd tin of turnips, day by day, until the 12th day. They tried to drink its blood to quench their thirst, but it became contaminated with sea water, so they drank their own urine instead. But this was a diminishing resource as the days went by. It rained a little, and the grateful men stood with their oilskins outstretched to catch whatever they could, and drank it. But it wasn't enough, and the sea-water got into this too, and spoiled what remained. The raw turtle meat was gone, and the parched sailors, scorched by the sun and the salt wind, sucked on turtle bones and chewed the skin for residual moisture. Then, gradually and by degrees, their minds turned to the unthinkable. The men knew what it meant. It was the so-called custom of the sea, an eventuality so terrible that although it was known to all seamen, it was discussed by few. There were 4 men. Custom dictated they must draw lots to decide which of them should be killed, that the others might live by feeding upon their flesh and blood. There are a great many tales alluding to such cannibalistic practices at sea, and in recent years they have acquired support by numerous writers as being an age-old custom of the sea. In 1643 it was reported by a Dutch traveller, the surgeon Nicholas Tulp, that 7 Englishmen in the Caribbean were lost at sea for 17 days and had cast lots to see who should be sacrificed. The loser was then killed and eaten. They were tried on the island of St. Christopher, but pardoned, according to his account, their actions being mitigated by necessity. But no record of such a trial exists in the West Indies, and the single reference to this, which spawned many others subsequently, was that of the Dutchman. The tale finds no support in any record or independent account at all, which such a dramatic event would surely have attracted. It suggests that this event may be a tale, or at best one founded on a real event of unknown origin which has been embellished in the retelling. Yet legal authorities have been known to cite this dubious tale as if it had such authority. A better evidenced tale is that of the American whale ship Essex in 1820, where a lifeboat of starving men held a lottery, and a man called Owen Coffin was killed and eaten in consequence. This story was told in 2 separate accounts, one of which was published soon after the event, which gives it some substance. It became famous, and Herman Melville used it, in part, 31 years later, as inspiration for his novel Moby Dick. And just 10 years before the case of the Mignonette, on the 9th of August 1874, the Euxine had indulged in the same grim practice, feasting on one of their number. As it had occurred in a far-flung post of empire out east, there were jurisdictional issues as to whether the matter should fall to Singapore or Britain, and no action was taken. There were certainly many stories about cannibalism among shipwreck survivors, and there can be no doubt that the men of the Mignonette had heard such stories. But now such stories were with the men, and their horror was real enough. Should they kill one of their number and eat them? It was probably on Skipper Tom Dudley's mind before he raised it, perhaps on the mate's, Edwin Stephens, too, as the days went by and their meagre resources were diminished. They grew tireder and hungrier. On the 20th of July, fearing their end would come, they inscribed upon the sextant case, "To whoever picks this up, Sunday, July 20th, p.m. We, Thomas Dudley, Edwin Stephens, Edmund Brooks and Richard Parker, the crew of the yacht Mignonette, which foundered on Saturday the 5th of July, have been in our little dinghy 15 days. We have neither food nor water, and are greatly reduced. We suppose our latitude to be 25 degrees south, our longitude 28 degrees west. May the Lord have mercy upon us. Please forward this to Southampton." The following day they discussed the matter of food earnestly. 16 days they had been adrift in an open boat, and 9 days without food, but they couldn't reach a decision on its remedy. By the 24th of July, 19 days at sea now, and 12 days without food, and with cabin boy Richard Parker and Edwin Stephens, the mate, sick from thirst or drinking sea-water, Dudley told them plainly that one of them must die to provide food for the others, and that the only way of doing this was by drawing lots. Edmund Brooks refused, saying, "I should not like anyone to kill me, and I should not like to kill anyone else. We should all die together." Then that evening Dudley again raised the matter privately with Stephens, saying, "The boy is dying. You have a wife and 5 children, and I have a wife and 3 children. Human flesh has been eaten before." He also pointed out that Richard Parker was only a lad without such responsibilities. Stephens nodded. Later he said of the matter, "The lad dying before our eyes, the longing for his blood came upon us." They glanced at the obstinate or faint-hearted Brooks and the recumbent cabin boy Richard Parker, oblivious to their decision, and agreed to wait until daybreak before acting. As the light broke and the small boat drifted helplessly upon the wide sea, heaving on the great swelling waves at the mercy of fate, without any change in their situation but a fervid desperation for survival driving them, Tom Dudley and Edwin Stephens exchanged dark looks. There was no need for words. It was the 20th day of their ordeal, and realizing Edmund Brooks would not agree, Dudley and Stephens signalled to each other silently that Parker, the cabin boy, should be killed. Becoming aware of what was afoot, Edmund Brooks went to the bow end of the boat and covered his head with his oilskin to close out the horror of what was about to occur. The accounts of what happened vary somewhat. It seems to be agreed that Tom Dudley said a brief prayer over Richard Parker, and that Stephens either held the 17-year-old cabin boy down to prevent him from struggling, or else stood aside with a receptacle at the ready to catch his blood. Parker awoke and said faintly, "What, me, sir?" And Dudley replied, "Yes, my boy, your time has come." Tom Dudley then took out his pocket-knife and plunged it into the side of Parker's throat. It took 15 seconds for him to die, he said. The job was done. Brooks at last peered out from beneath his oilskin and saw the staring whites of Parker's eyes, and fainted. Then the other 2 men, Dudley and Stephens, seized the compass and chronometer case and one of the empty turnip tins and collected his blood from Parker's jugular, and drank it greedily. In Tom Dudley's words, "We was all like mad wolves, who should get the most?" Brooks recovered and joined in their feast. Dudley then stripped the clothes from Parker and butchered him like a sheared lamb with his pocket-knife, and the men ate his heart and liver first. Then they cut strips of raw meat from his limbs to gorge themselves on. They heaved unwanted scraps, offensive parts they called them, overboard. For the next 4 days they lived like this, still consuming the flesh of their victim from their terrible pantry. The meat was rotting, the conditions in the boat atrocious. Yet 3 men still lived, clinging to existence, barely human. Ironically, that same day on which they gave in to temptation and butchered their shipmate, it rained. They held out their oilskins and drank the water, which cleansed their bloody faces too. Then, on the 29th of July, some 24 days after the Mignonette had sunk, Brooks, who was steering at the time, saw something on the horizon. It was an impossible sight, almost a mirage. "A sail!" he cried. The German bark, Montezuma, trading from South America with a cargo of guano nitrates headed for Hamburg, spotted them, a speck in the ocean. The vessel's lookout, Visa, picked them out by telescope, and the curious ship set a course to rescue the frantic men. It took 1.5 hours for the Montezuma to reach them. As it drew alongside the tiny boat, they could hardly believe the appalling sight they beheld. 3 wasted men, wide-eyed with starvation, skeletal, their feet swollen by sea-water, ravenous enough to eat human flesh, and a boy butchered and rotting dismembered in the boat, his ribs picked clean, hidden beneath the rags of his clothes. The German captain, Simonson, ordered them to be taken aboard, and the remnants of Richard Parker were thrown overboard. The punt was roped and hauled on deck also. The captain and men of the Montezuma would have their nightmares supplied with what they had seen for the rest of their days. The men's position was latitude 2420 south, longitude 2825 west, when they were recovered. They had drifted 1,000 miles west towards Brazil. It was to be 5 more weeks before the Montezuma entered the English Channel, by which time the men had largely recovered from their ordeal. A pilot, touting for business amongst vessels in the English Channel, approached the Montezuma, and the captain informed him he had 3 English castaways, and requested him to take them ashore for him, as he was bound for Hamburg. But the pilot informed him it was law that he take them himself, and put into port for this purpose. Simonson did so. The captain and 3 men duly went to the customs officer and receiver of wrecks, Mr. R. G. Cheeseman, at the Falmouth Customs House, to report their arrival. They recounted their story in the presence of the harbour police officer, Sergeant James Laverty. As he listened to their candid account of what had happened and what they had done, he quickly realized the seriousness of the matter to which they had openly confessed, and on the authority of warrants issued by the mayor, Henry Liddicote, he arrested Dudley, Stephens, and Brooks on suspicion of murder and took them to the local jail. The men were indignant. They had done nothing wrong. It was the custom of the sea, they protested. All sailors knew of it. The matter came before magistrates at Falmouth Town Hall on the 8th of September, the men being represented by local solicitor Henry Tilley, and bail was refused. The 3 men were remanded in custody until the 11th for the magistrates to communicate the matter with the Treasury, after which further hearing they were bailed in the sum of £200 for the captain, Tom Dudley, and £100 each for the other 2 men, by John Burton, the owner of the Old Curiosity Shop in Falmouth, named after the Dickens novel and London shop of this name. The news of the Mignonette and its crew electrified the country, as such stories do. 2 of the greatest human taboos had been breached by 3 desperate men: murder and cannibalism. People were divided by sympathy and horror at the ghastliness of the tale. It is said that Falmouth was generally sympathetic to the plight of the 3 men, its being a port and its populace a seafaring community, and that a brother of Richard Parker, Daniel, shook hands with the men publicly, an acknowledgment that he bore them no malice. He also, however, asked for any wages due his brother to be paid to him. But so far as the law was concerned, whatever the dire conditions the men had laboured under, and whatever the inducements to try to preserve their lives, they had murdered a 17-year-old boy. The custom of the sea might have a place amongst seamen and savages, a kind of harrowing folklore, but it had no place in the laws and practices of a civilized society. On the 18th of September, amidst huge public interest, the men again appeared in court, charged with having feloniously, wilfully, and with malice aforethought killed and murdered Richard Parker on the high seas. The Treasury Counsel, William Otto Dankwitz, offered no evidence against Edmund Brooks, on the basis that it was acknowledged that he had played no part in the killing of Parker, and had also refused to agree to the drawing of lots or to the victimization of Parker for the men's sustenance. It was understood, too, that his testimony would be required if a conviction was sought for murder against his 2 crewmates. The magistrates' court heard the details of the case. Dankwitz said that all would feel pity for the men, but by the law of England, anyone who took another person's life was guilty of murder. The depositions of the three men, given to R.G. Cheeseman, Receiver of Wrecks and Customs Officer, were read to the court. Solicitor Henry Tilley objected to the statements being heard on the basis that none of the three had been cautioned, but had made the statements voluntarily, all expecting that no action would follow. Nevertheless, the magistrates committed them for trial at Exeter Winter Assizes, scheduled to begin on the 1st of November 1884. A defence fund was established and attracted a great many contributions. The owner of the Mignonette, Jack Want, even sent £100 from Sydney, approximately £15,000 in 2024. The matter came before a grand jury on the 3rd of November 1884. Justice John Walter Huddleston presided over the court, and the line he took was emphatic from the outset. As far as the claim that the men were acting from necessity went, he said, I can find no authority for that proposition, and know of no such provision in the laws of England. It was also quite impossible, he said, to argue self-defence in this case. Their lives were imperilled not by Parker, but by the absence of food and drink. Further, if the boy's death was caused or accelerated by the act of one or both of the accused, it was a case of deliberate homicide. In such a case, the grand jury must find a true bill of murder against them. With this heavy steer, the grand jury returned a true bill against Stephens and Dudley. The trial of Thomas Dudley and Edwin Stephens commenced on the 6th of November, 1884, before Huddleston. Judge Huddleston was himself from a seafaring family, and had been Judge Advocate of the Fleet some years earlier, and so was well placed to hear the case. Arthur Charles, Q.C., prosecuted for the Crown, and Arthur J.H. Collins, Q.C., acted for the defence. It was beset with problems. To begin with, until 1898, an accused person could not appear in the witness box to give evidence in their own defence. This effectively meant that if all three men had been charged with the murder of Richard Parker, then none could speak in court, and there would be no first-hand account of the crime given, which meant the case would inevitably collapse. By offering no charges against Brooks, his account of the men's actions could be heard in court, and the case of murder could be prosecuted against the remaining two. Arthur Charles, Q.C., opened for the Crown, dismissing the notion that the men had acted out of necessity in killing Parker, and he likewise dismissed the defence of insanity. The men's claim that they said a prayer over the unfortunate Richard Parker indicated full knowledge of the nature of what they were about to do, he said. He did suggest, however, that an appeal to clemency, because of the exigency of their circumstances, might be appropriate. There was a recognition that the men had acted in extenuating circumstances. Arthur Collins, Q.C., acting for the men, argued that as the boat was not a British vessel, which the Merchant Shipping Act defined as any vessel being used in navigation not propelled by oars, then the boat in which the killing took place was not a British vessel. Had the killing taken place aboard the Mignonette, then jurisdiction would be established. But this was not so, and therefore the court had no jurisdiction in the matter. Judge Huddleston suggested that the boat was part of the yacht, and therefore bound by the same rules. Arthur Charles, for the prosecution, declared that by statute of Henry VIII, which was the foundation of the Merchant Shipping Act, any crime on either ship or boat fell within the jurisdiction of the law. This is surely an occasion when such arguments bring the law into disrepute, and in any case, if such an argument negating jurisdiction was to be pursued, even in a strictly technical sense, it would be defeated. As a makeshift sail had been constructed, the boat had effectively been converted to a ship, just as a bicycle which had a powerful motor attached to it, would be converted to a motor vehicle, or a glider with an engine would become an airplane. This had no possible bearing on the chief arguments of the matter, and was fortunately dismissed. The witnesses were heard concerning the unfolding of the story of the mariners and their arrest, but the main evidence was that of Edmund Brooks. He gave his account of Stephens and Dudley's actions in the boat, of the atrocious conditions under which the 4 sailors laboured to stay alive, and he accepted the suggestion of counsel for the defence that it was the belief of all 3 men that Parker would die first. Arthur Collins continued to press the claim of his client's needs, and said in their judgment Parker's death was imminent, and probably all 4 would have died before the Montezuma could have rescued them 4 days later. So pitiable was their condition. He insisted Dudley and Stephens should be acquitted, because they had acted from necessity. Huddleston refused to countenance the defence of necessity, but he could sense the tendency to sympathy amongst the public and in the jury. He also realized that if the jury acquitted the men out of sympathy for their suffering, then the matter of necessity as a defence in a case of murder would be established. He was not prepared to allow this. He therefore directed the jury to return a special verdict, a rare device by which the matter would be referred to a panel of judges for consideration. He presented them with a sympathetic narrative verdict of the nature of the circumstances, which ended, "But whether the prisoners were and are guilty of murder, the jury are ignorant, and refer to the court." The matter was referred to the Royal Courts of Justice for the 25th of November, 1884. Here, on the appointed day, it was heard in No. 2 Court, the case being presented for the Crown, again by Arthur Charles, Q.C., with Collins again acting for the prisoners. Once again it quickly became bogged down by procedural issues and questions relating to the court's authority and jurisdiction in the matter. It was adjourned for resolution of these, to be heard on the 4th of December. Here 5 judges, Justice Grove, Justice Denman, Baron Pollock, and Baron Huddleston, sat at a specially convened Queen's Bench Divisional Court, presided over by the Lord Chief Justice Coleridge. The report of the extra trial of R.V. Dudley and Stephens was read out in full to the justices. Arthur Collins, for the defence, again challenged the competence of the court to rule in the matter, as the Exeter jury had not given a verdict, but were obliged to return a special verdict deferring to the court. The proper course was for the matter to be heard at the assizes, and a verdict duly given by the jury, he said. The Queen's Divisional Court rejected this. The matter had been referred to the Royal Court of Justice, and they were the body best constituted to hear the case. Charles, for the Crown, argued there was no common law authority to support necessity as a defence for murder. He also said Parker might have been saved by the appearance of a ship at any moment. By killing Parker, the men obtained no permanent relief from their predicament. Only the chance appearance of a ship did this. Had the men stolen bread from Parker, it would be considered theft by any court. It therefore followed, a fortiori, they were guilty of theft and murder because they effectively did both. The judges retired and conferred, and agreed on a conviction of murder. Tom Dudley and Edwin Stephens were thus confined to Holloway Prison until the 9th of December, for sentence to be passed and details of the court's ruling to be given. This ruling was then handed down that there was no defence of necessity to a charge of murder on the basis of legal procedure or ethics. In particular, it found in its judgment, to preserve one's life is a duty, but it may be the plainest and highest duty to sacrifice it. War is full of instances in which it is a man's duty not to live, but to die. The duty in the case of shipwreck, of a captain to his crew, of the crew to its passengers, of soldiers to women and children, impose on man the moral necessity not of the preservation, but of the sacrifice of their lives for others. To allow the principle of necessity to succeed would invest in some the right to determine who should live and who should die. It would further provide a cloak for crime. The ruling also accepted that the temptation facing the men had been a terrible one, perhaps such that any man would submit to, but the principle that temptation could not be resisted must be denied at any cost. Dudley and Stephens were thus sentenced to death, but with a recommendation to mercy. It was widely expected that the two men would immediately be pardoned by the Queen. In practice, this meant she would act on the advice of the Home Secretary, Sir William Harcourt. Harcourt was an opponent of the death penalty, but he saw the difficulty of pardoning two men convicted of murder. It was contrary to the principle of justice, in his view, that two men convicted of murder in a court of law should simply walk free. The court had refused to allow the consideration by the jury of a verdict of manslaughter, which would have involved a shorter sentence, and the punishment for murder was death. It was thus necessary that some form of punishment be meted out to the men in recognition of this. Following consultation with the Solicitor General and the Attorney General, the chief law officers of the government, Sir William Harcourt decided that the two men should not be pardoned, but rather given a short prison sentence of 6 months' duration each, without hard labour, and at what was then regarded as being the most comfortable of prisons. Holloway. He believed it was the softest sentence that could possibly be handed down in the circumstances. Tom Dudley and Edwin Stephens were thus returned to prison to serve their sentences. The judges had rejected the custom of the sea as firmly as they had rejected the defence of acting from necessity in a case of murder. The principle of necessity springs from the recognition that there are situations of such urgency in life that makes it imperative to break the law. This obviously differs from self-defence, in which a person is attacked and in defending themselves kills their attacker. This is almost always accepted as a defence in law, but necessity arises only rarely in English law. It was established by the Mignonette case that the principle of necessity as a defence cannot apply in the case of murder. Harming another person could not be accepted as a matter of necessity unless immediate harm or death would occur to the perpetrator. The problem for Dudley and Stephens in claiming necessity was that the outcome was uncertain, the infraction extreme. They could not know Parker would die imminently, nor that killing him would ensure their survival. The situation was not immediate, but the remedy was extreme. They killed the boy in the hope it would provide them relief. At any moment a ship might appear. No one could know. It actually did. Cannibalism was not, surprisingly, an offence if death occurred naturally. The dangers of admitting necessity in almost all circumstances are clear. Lord Denning ruled in 1971 that if hunger were allowed to constitute necessity, then any hungry person could smash a window and steal food and simply explain that they were hungry. That would defeat the purpose of the law. That seems straightforward. A more difficult and poignant application of the law governing necessity arose in 2001 in England. This concerned a proposed operation for the separation of conjoined twins. Two girls, called Mary and Jodie, joined vitally at the pelvis, would die within 6 months unless surgery was carried out to separate them. But the surgery would cause the death of one of the twins. It was a tragic case in which no decision was likely to be entirely satisfactory, and yet one which it was judged by medical staff needed to be taken urgently. The matter went to the Court of Appeal, and here the lawfulness of the surgery that would save one and kill the other twin was established as a necessity by the fact that one conjoined twin was in effect killing the other simply by living. The decision of the judges was not unanimous, though. One judge rejected this on the basis that the doctor who had performed the surgery was not having his life threatened. He was, in fact, making a rational choice. That dissenting judge was surely correct, and it seemed likely the other judges may have concurred, but were seeking to make a pragmatic decision based on a real-life situation in which both twins would die if they did not act to permit the separation operation to take place. But this dire case does not compare to the situation of Dudley and Stephens. Their decision was a rational one, but one made in favour of themselves. The only compulsion upon them to act was their own needs. It is not enough. There are two parts to a consideration of the Mignonette case. One is legal, the other is ethical, and the two are inextricably linked because at their heart is the gravest of legal and moral offences, that of murder. In terms of the legal standpoint, necessity as a defence in law against a charge of murder was anathema. Huddleston explained to the jury why this was so. He was right. It was a challenge to the basis of law and order in society to allow such a defence. It may also be said that we all act from a degree of necessity when we break the law. I steal a car because I can't afford one. I rob a bank or shop or burgle a house because I don't have any money. Such matters are obviously very different from being adrift in the Atlantic Ocean in a boat without food or water. But to admit of a sliding scale of necessity would drive a stake into the heart of the principle that the law divides right from wrong, and in particular that killing an innocent human being is never right. Huddleston and those whom he consulted on this unusual case saw the danger of permitting a jury to make a decision on such an important point of law. He thought it a matter to be settled only by a higher court of judges. This was a tricky thing to manage. This was, after all, a murder trial in which the defendants had the right of being tried by 12 of their peers. But there was a real danger that a jury understandably sympathetic to the plight of the men in the dock, who did not wish to see them hang for what they had done in such extreme circumstances, might choose to acquit the two men, which would have the effect of creating a precedent of the defence of necessity for murder. The means Huddleston devised to avoid this was the best he could manage. He directed the jury to return a special verdict, which would defer the matter to a panel of judges before whom the defence of necessity could be argued and the principle settled by thoughtful deliberation, rather than by an unintended consequence of an acquittal. There is no ideal answer to the difficulty facing the legal system in such cases. Previous occasions similar to this had been averted or quietly dropped because of the dilemma involved. Necessity in doing what such men had done on numerous occasions in circumstances such as those Dudley and Stephens had been faced with seemed to be acknowledged in some fashion, judging from the support the men received, and yet an instrument whose purpose was to divide right from wrong in a practical and administrable way could not accept that a crime of such magnitude as the deliberate killing of another innocent human being could be sanctioned by it. In Britain today, the Crown Prosecution Service determines which cases to prosecute on the basis that A. It must have a reasonable chance of success, and B. It must be in the public interest for a prosecution to take place. Thus, by determining that a matter of this kind is not in the public interest, the problem is sidestepped. But this is by no means an ideal position either. It is an acknowledgment, perhaps, that the law cannot prescribe for every complex human situation. It seems likely, even a certainty, that Dudley and Stephens would face no charges today. That may seem to many, perhaps to most, a satisfactory outcome. After all, these two men pose no individual threat to society. But there are several points of disquiet in the case, too, which argue strongly against the actions of Dudley and Stephens. 1. The men acted solely out of self-interest and instincts for their own preservation in killing Parker. 2. Even from the viewpoint claimed, that of the so-called custom of the sea, their act was deficient. No lots were drawn to select a victim, as in other cases we know of. Thus, those who took the decision to kill and carried it out did not place themselves at equal peril with their victim. Every person, every schoolchild, understands that principle of equality in social situations. 3. There was no agreement among the men that they should kill Parker. It was the decision taken by two men, especially one, Dudley, in apparent defiance of another, Brooks. 4. The victim was selected on the basis that he was going to die anyway. Yet that is hardly sufficient. All four men were going to die. The criteria for selecting the cabin boy was that he was going to die first. That is different. It involved a judgment that he would die first, that their lives would be prolonged by sacrificing his. 5. It is a fact that the cabin boy was ill, believed by at least two of the men that he would be first to die. They might be mistaken. They were not doctors. On at least one occasion, Brooks said he had believed Stephens would die first. And even if their judgment was correct, then why did they not wait for nature to take its course and then decide to eat Richard Parker? It suggests that necessity was to an extent driving their diagnosis of Parker's condition. 6. Flowing from this is the fact that Parker was the cabin boy. It is a hypothetical question, but had he been awake and in the same condition as the other men, would he have had an equal chance of living, and another of being sacrificed in his place? Or was his selection as victim, at least in part, driven by his being of the lowest status? There is some suggestion that value was being applied to each man's life in this. Dudley said so explicitly when he spoke to Stephens on the evening of the 24th of July. "I am married and have 3 children, and you are married and have 5 children. Parker has no dependents." In fact, Parker was an orphan. The implication is he would hardly be missed. This is suggestive that selection was being made not on the basis of equality, as the custom of the sea dictated, or any other construction of natural justice, but on the basis of a value apportioned by one man with the agreement of another, who were also the beneficiaries and self-appointed killers. Richard Parker might consider their respective values differently. He might point to his youth and having his whole life in front of him, to the others being, comparatively speaking, old with shorter life expectations. There could be many ways of apportioning value to an individual's life. It could not be left in the hands of an individual to volunteer another's as being of lesser worth than their own. It suggests that in so doing, the two men acted purely out of self-interest, their own desire to live. And what of the so-called custom of the sea, often presented in recent years as an unofficial common law in which the British legal system sought to interfere? It is a controversial matter. The best-known writer on the case of the Mignonette, Professor Brian Simpson, who wrote a book, Cannibalism and the Common Law, the story of the tragic last voyage of the Mignonette, in 1984, did much to promote it as an established practice amongst mariners, and that its status amounted to a common law amongst men of the sea, which the English legal system was anxious to challenge. But this is, to my mind, quite mistaken. Many of the stories he cites in support of his view are with little or no foundation, but are readily accepted by him as evidence of a common law practice relating to survival cannibalism. There are no shortage of such stories. Tales of cannibalism among sailors, marooned and starved to a kind of madness, are as old as the sea. Weathered sailors sit and tell such tales before flickering flames on dark winter nights to frighten themselves and others. But such events, even when real, hardly amount to a common law of the sea. There is no doubt that men have resorted to cannibalism when isolated and suffering a great deprivation, and that they have often resorted to some means of deciding who should die, is a natural consequence of the human social desire to regulate their own actions. As children will decide who goes first in a game by using an ip-dip-dip or one potato, two potato methodology, or else flip a coin, heads or tails. It does not constitute a common law of the playground. That men had previously been said to have adopted such a methodology for deciding who to maroon or kill or abandon points to the human habit of fairness in general, not to a common law in a specific and highly rare circumstance, that of deciding to kill and eat one of their company. It is also obvious that in proposing that the men eat Parker, neither Dudley nor any of his shipmates mentioned or referred to any custom of the sea, which they surely would have done if they thought it existed. Dudley said merely, "Human flesh has been eaten before." This hardly gives support to the idea that he believed they would be acting in accordance with some common law tradition or practice. Nor did Stephens offer anything of this kind in the statement he made by way of justification for their actions. He suggested they had longed for his blood. And Brooks, the eldest and most experienced of the three men, appears to deny that such a tradition existed at all, in saying, "I would not like to kill anyone, nor anyone else kill me," which suggests moral abhorrence, and that it was not sanctioned by any lawful authority or practice. Yet in spite of this, the custom of the sea appears to have gained in popularity in recent years, in part as a result of Professor Brian Simpson's book promoting this idea, and other books have arisen citing the custom of the sea. Against this, the anthropologist William Ahrens, in his work The Man-Eating Myth, cast doubt on the justification for a belief in cannibalism having any institutionalized foundation at all. He has been criticized for his work, but I am inclined to think he is more right than wrong. And as far as the custom of the sea goes, it is a confabulation of tales and actual instances of cannibalism, contrived into something very much akin to a myth. The custom of the sea has no greater claim upon legitimacy than removing the scalp or head of enemies in battle can be claimed as a custom of war. Both are defeated by a superior canon of law, which has and must take precedence. It seems to me that in legal and moral terms, Stephens and Dudley were wrong. They murdered Richard Parker because they could, and they did it to prolong their own lives. The Royal Court of Justices were correct in stating that there are occasions when there is a greater duty than the preservation of one's own life, that of sacrificing it. The judgment that sacrificing one's life in war constitutes such a duty might be challenged in an age where we have seen many wars prosecuted not for the greater good of many, but for the benefits of a few. But few would argue against the greater good of a fireman who rescues a child from a blazing building at the cost of his own, or a person diving from a boat to save the life of a drowning woman and losing their own. Furthermore, it is sometimes, as Judge Huddleston stated at the Exeter trial, the case that a man ought to die rather than kill an innocent person. Perhaps the best argument in Dudley and Stephens' favour is that they had succumbed to a kind of madness. 4 men in a tiny boat, divorced from all other human society and the laws which govern it, faced with the vastness of the sea, starvation and thirst unseating their reason, and causing them to consider monstrous ideas that would appall the lowest villain, and in such madness, their skin loose upon their bones, their legs bloated by constant immersion in salt water, they did the unthinkable. Sane men would wonder at their actions. They would marvel themselves at these in the months and years ahead. Tom Dudley and Edwin Stephens served 6 months in Holloway Prison and were released at 7 a.m. on the 20th of May, 1885. Dudley was quite unrepentant, and the net effect was that the brief and violent end of Richard Parker's life was somewhat eclipsed, but not entirely. And Mr. Haskins of Victoria Street, London, paid for a memorial stone to be laid near to a place where the boy's mother and father were buried, at Peartree Church, Southampton. A drawing of Richard Parker was commissioned by means of a photo of his brother William, taken at the age of 17, who was said to closely resemble Richard. Edmund Brooks enjoyed brief notoriety with a circus, touring with a macabre act called The Cannibal of the High Seas, which involved him being given a slab of raw meat and him demonstrating how the cabin boy, Richard Parker, had been eaten by his 3 shipmates. The show was of limited duration, and he returned to work on South Coast ferries, marrying in 1892 and eventually dying in 1919. Edwin Stephens was said never really to have recovered from his ordeal. It is said his marriage failed and he turned to drink, but I can find no evidence for this. He was still married and living with his wife at the time of his death, which occurred in Hull in 1914, when he was 66 years old. Thomas Dudley never accepted that he had done anything wrong. He remained indignant that he had been found guilty of murder and had spent 6 months in jail. After his release, he braved the passage to Sydney one more time. He emigrated there with his wife and children on the 19th of August, 1885, and here opened a ship's chandlery, Thomas Dudley and Co., at 51 Sussex Street. He was to make the news one last time. While living at Cambridge Street, Drummoyne, in February 1900, he fell ill. The diagnosis was bubonic plague caused by an increase in the population of rats, and the Board of Health isolated the house and quarantined those within. Dudley died on the 23rd of February 1900, apparently the first person in Australia to die of bubonic plague. His body was wrapped in disinfected sheeting and placed in a small skiff, not unlike the one which he and the crew of the Mignonette had inhabited for 3 weeks, 15 years earlier, and this was towed downstream to a place of quarantine and pitched without ceremony into an unmarked grave. He was 46 years old. It is a curious fact that in 1837, almost 50 years before the Mignonette case, Edgar Allan Poe penned a story called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, a horror story in which a desperate crew facing starvation draw lots to decide whom they should eat. The name of the character who was unfortunate enough to draw the lot was Richard Parker. A prescient coincidence.